Hey everyone, blah 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 blah. I've got spooky lights. Spooky lights. Once upon a murder. Hi everybody, thanks so much for joining me for another episode of Once Upon a Murder. If you click in this area over here, hopefully, I'll have found a way to take you to my last week's video about the murder of Shanda Sharer. So if you haven't seen that one, that'd be cool to watch too whenever you're done watching this one. Today I want to talk about the life and death of Elizabeth Short, who is better known as the Black Dahlia. Elizabeth Short was born July 29th, 1924 in Boston, Massachusetts, and she was raised in Massachusetts. She was the third of 5 girls. To Elizabeth, you know, California, and I guess to this day, is like the land of fame. So she wanted to go, that's what she wanted to do, and she went for it, like a superstar that she was. So she headed out to live with her father in 1943, and not too long after that, her and her father's relationship kind of strained, which doesn't surprise me. I mean, he left her when she was 5. So he kicked her out in 1943, and that's kind of when she had to fend for herself in California. This same year, 1943, on September 23rd, Elizabeth was arrested for underage drinking, which is where the famous mugshot and the photo that is most used of her comes from. The police officer that arrested her felt sorry for her and so had arranged for her to go back to Massachusetts. I don't know how that works, how a police officer can determine where you're gonna go, but that is what is said to have happened. So the police officer had made plans to send her back to Massachusetts, and she ended up in California again. This time she went straight to Hollywood. Not too long after she was there, she met this man named Lieutenant Gordon Kiessling, and she fell in love with him. Made plans to marry quickly after that. However, he was shipped out to Europe, and their relationship kind of got estranged from there. She lived in Miami for some while, and while she was there, she was dating a lot of guys, still thinking about marriage. You know, ultimately that's the picture that she was headed for. She fell in love with another pilot man, and his name was Matthew Gordon. Matthew and Elizabeth had plans to marry as soon as he had arrived back from India, but unfortunately he died while he was out there. After his death, Elizabeth sort of went around saying that they were already married and that she was pregnant, but she lost the child. Oh, this was not true. They never got married, they only had plans, and there was actually no evidence to suggest that she was pregnant or that she had had a child. So, you know, in this season of mourning, after losing the man that she had planned to marry, she decided to contact some old Hollywood friends, and she moved back out there. She was staying with her friend Mark Hansen, who, when interviewed, later went on to say this: "I didn't see her, but she was sitting there one night. I came home with Anne about 5:30, 6 o'clock, sitting and crying and saying that she had to get out of there. She was crying about being scared, one thing and another, I don't know." So Elizabeth was going to leave Los Angeles December 8th, 1946 to take a bus to San Diego. Elizabeth made it to San Diego, where another girl, Dorothy French, had offered her a home because she found her sleeping in one of the theaters that Elizabeth had worked at with Dorothy at the time. So Dorothy offered a place to stay at her mother's with her for a few days, and Elizabeth ended up staying there for a whole month. So basically, Elizabeth, being out in California, trying to live the dream, trying to become an actress, it was more of a reality of just bouncing from house to house and not really having a solid place to stay, which I think inevitably made the murder so much harder because she had known so many people. So while Elizabeth was living in the French household for that time in the month in San Diego, she continued her late night partying and her dating habits, when really the girl was just trying to get a husband. So a man that she was said to be seen with a lot was Robert Manley, or mostly known as Red. He was a salesman from Los Angeles who had a pregnant wife at home. One of these nights they decided to go to a party, and Elizabeth, wanted to go back to Hollywood. So Manley picks her up January 8th, 1947, They go to Hollywood, they check into a hotel, and they go to party that night. So Manley had an appointment the next morning where he left the hotel, and he says that when he came back, Elizabeth asked that she wanted to go back to Massachusetts, but first she had to meet her sister at the Biltmore Hotel in Hollywood. So Red Manley claims to have driven her over there, but that he had other things to do, so he just dropped her off and left. The last that Red had seen of Elizabeth was that she was making phone calls in the hotel lobby that day. So Manley and the hotel employees of the Biltmore Hotel were technically the last people to see Elizabeth Short alive. She was missing from January 9th to January 15th when her body was found. So this is where we dive into the story of the Black Dahlia. January 15th, 1947, a mother was walking with her child in a stroller, and she came across a body. And you guessed it, it's Elizabeth Short's body. So the body was posed in such a way that the woman who had found the body genuinely thought it was a mannequin. And I'll tell you why. Because the damn thing was cut right in half at her waist, so she was legs and torso and head. Her legs were spread open and her arms were above. I'll just show a picture. So this is where it gets a little graphic. Elizabeth Short had been cut in half, posed in the grass in a vacant parking lot, and she was drained completely of blood. She also had cuts from ear to ear as if it was a permanent smile. Her body was found naked in a vacant lot. Her hair was freshly shampooed. In fact, it was still wet. They estimated that Elizabeth had been tortured for about 4 hours. Her pubic hair had been shaved, and parts of her body that were cut off were found shoved inside of her. There were also cigarette burns found all on her skin. The body was totally mutilated. The media quickly jumped on this because, I mean, that's a big deal. Just because of how gruesome, violent it was. And she was only 22 years old. You know, this was a girl who had come out to be famous and live the dream and, you know, got a little more than she bargained for. A lot more than she bargained for. Right away, though, the media started making different conspiracies and made her out to seem like a prostitute. There's rumors that she was a tag team with Marilyn Monroe, that she was a stripper, that she had been involved with the mob, that she was impregnated by some celebrities and that's why she was killed. And there's so much that came out about her. Multiple accounts from her friends say that that's not the kind of person she was. Ultimately, the cause of death was actually blunt force trauma to the head and loss of blood. So they believe that it was the loss of blood from the blunt force trauma as well as the loss of blood from the cuts on her face. They believed that the big cut had been done post-mortem. The LAPD interviewed literally thousands of people on this murder. There were so many suspects. There were a lot of people who came out and said that they had done it too, but didn't, and were proved to not be anywhere in the vicinity at the time of her death. Why confess to a murder you didn't commit? But why commit a murder, I guess, is the better question in the first place. Anyway, so there were a ton of suspects because Elizabeth knew a ton of people, which is way more than I can say for myself. If I ever die, like, you know exactly who killed me. I have like 5 people that are close to me. Maybe the moral of the story is like, don't go out, don't know people. Maybe that's what's cool now. So after the body had been identified as Elizabeth Short, reporters actually called her mother, Phoebe Sawyer Short, and had told her that her daughter won a beauty contest and that they were trying to get as much personal information as they could about her. And then after they got all their scoop info, they told her that her daughter had actually been murdered. Like, that hurts. That's heartless. That's messed up. Shame. So on January 23rd, just a few days after Elizabeth's body was discovered, the Examiner actually received a call from somebody who was claiming to be the Black Dahlia killer. He told the editor that he was upset with how the story was being told and that he was going to be sending Elizabeth's belongings in the mail shortly after. And sure enough, a few days later, a package was delivered, and it contained Elizabeth's birth certificate, business cards, photographs, and an address book that had the name Mark Hansen on it. And then the Herald Express started receiving letters from somebody claiming to be the Black Dahlia killer. And they were, like magazine cutout sort of letters. So the Examiner received this package and letter formulated from magazine clippings from an anonymous sender the next day after he received that phone call. And not too short after, Elizabeth's shoes and handbag were discovered in a dumpster nearby to the vacant lot, just a few miles away, and Robert Red Manley identified them as Elizabeth's. The packages and the letters that were sent to the Examiner were, the package was like drenched in gasoline to wipe away any fingerprints, but they were still able to pick up some prints from it, and they ran it through their database and came up empty-handed. What's really crazy to me is that a lot of recent accusations that are coming out make a lot of freaking sense for these suspects, but the evidence, any physical evidence, any evidence from the crime scene is lost. Yeah, nobody knows where it is. They don't have any anymore. So there's no real chance to find the killer and back it up with some science. Anyway, let's get into the suspects. So the first suspect that I want to talk about is Walter Bailey. Walter Bailey was not an original suspect. He didn't actually become suspected until more recently. He was an LA surgeon who lived just a block away from where Black Dahlia was located, and he actually had some sort of direct connection to Elizabeth. His daughter was in Elizabeth's sister's wedding. She was actually the matron of honor of Virginia Short's wedding. So there was definitely some sort of connection there. Walter Bailey left his wife for his mistress, who was also a doctor, and he died about a year later after the Black Dahlia murder, and he left all of his belongings to his mistress. When they asked his ex-wife about this, she said that it's because his mistress knew about his terrible, terrible secrets. Some people speculate that Walter Bailey was performing abortions, which were illegal at the time, and that sort of also goes off where people believe that Elizabeth Short was having an abortion done by Walter Bailey, but there was no evidence that she was actually pregnant. But they say that she was having an abortion and it had gone wrong, and so they sort of had to stage it as this murder. He sort of had to stage it. Some people say that his mistress was in it as well, being that she was a doctor. But anyway, so that is one conspiracy. Oh my God. So that is one conspiracy theory of Walter Bailey, but also murder. He could have killed Elizabeth Short. It was also discovered after his death that he had a degenerative brain disease, which caused violence in normally passive people. So this brain disease that he was not diagnosed with when he was alive is known to bring out violent behavior and tendencies in people. Out of almost all the suspects, he's the only one who really has a direct connection to Elizabeth and a direct connection to the location of the lot where her body was found. He was 67, I believe, at the time of the murder, so some people speculate that this is why it was cut in half, because it made it a lot easier to pick up and carry. The smile that was carved into her face obviously had a lot of anger and resentment behind it, and some people sort of believe that Elizabeth Short had gone around, this is a fact, that Elizabeth Short had gone around and said that she had lost a child, which wasn't true. She never had a child, she was never pregnant, and Walter Bailey actually did have a son who died at the age of 11. He was hit by a car, and this is kind of where it all lines up, is that his son's birthday was January 13th of whatever year he was born. So the death of Elizabeth Short actually fell on the anniversary of his son's birthday. So that's kind of, a little backstory there. So that's Walter Bailey. The second suspect that I have listed is Lesley Dylan. Lesley Dylan was a 27-year-old. He was a bellhop, and he also worked as a mortician's assistant. So he definitely had some experience in draining blood from bodies. He could have done it. His whereabouts of the few days that Elizabeth was missing are totally unknown, and he couldn't provide any sort of solid proof of where he was or what he was doing those days. He also lived just down the block from the dumpster that Elizabeth's shoes and handbag were found in. He showed a lot of interest in intense, sexually violent and sadistic stories, I guess you could say. So he definitely did have sort of that behavior. They had set him up to meet with some undercover cops, and he sort of was offering really intimate details about the crime. They asked him what he would do with the pubic hairs that were shaved off of Elizabeth's body, and he sort of said, I would flush it. And what about the tattoo that was removed from her inner thigh? He said, well, I imagine that the murderer would also flush it. And he said that in the past, for his work, he would surgically remove a part of the inner thigh and stick a tube in there in order to drain the blood from a body, which there was a piece of Elizabeth's inner thigh missing. Basically he offered intimate details about the crime. So it kind of made him a really good suspect, I think. And then those same undercover cops decided that they had enough on him, and they kind of took him from there. So they took him and they actually wrongfully held him, and they did not let him have a lawyer. He was detained wrongfully, and so they couldn't prosecute. So everything that, any little details that he had said about the murder, anything that he had said about Elizabeth, anything that he could have confessed to, everything was just inadmissible in court. So George Hodel was actually one of the prime suspects after the Black Dahlia had appeared. His son believes that he is the Black Dahlia killer. However, his son also believes that he's the Zodiac killer. So his son kind of loses credibility. You'd be amazed at how many people think their father was some sort of serial killer back then. I mean, that's some daddy issues on another level. George Hodel was a physician specializing in sexually transmitted diseases, and his son says that in their house he actually had a secret room that nobody could go into, which is not normal. I'm gonna go ahead and say that that kind of just makes a man guilty of something, for sure. Not a good guy. Molested his 14-year-old daughter. Had 3 witnesses who said, yeah, he definitely molested his 14-year-old daughter, and then he was acquitted, because that's what happens in America. So the police had hidden microphones around George, and they got some really weird quotes, and this is something he actually said. Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead. That's a real quote. You can quote him on that because he said that. Those words came out of his mouth. The secretary that he's talking about is Ruth Spaulding, who the police had already previously suspected him of murdering her in 1945 because... You okay, Artemis? Because Spaulding had overdosed and he was there and had burnt some of her papers before calling the police. Years later, his son, who actually became a homicide detective with the LAPD, he arranged for dogs to come to his former house where his father lived and sniff out for human remains. And the dogs definitely identified in a back alley of the house that there were human remains there. I'm just gonna go ahead and say that this guy should have been put away. So, one of the big things sort of that Steve Hodel came out with and said is that when his father had died and he went to go pick up his things, he was going through it and he found a photograph of who he strongly believes to be Elizabeth Short, but it's not her. It's just, it doesn't even look like her. So there's just so much behind it, especially the more you look into it. There's a whole, well, there's many sites that are just dedicated to this case, and really you can see that it just goes off in 103 different directions. Like, it really is. But I think there's really a strong case against a few people, and unfortunately they're just all dead. So I just don't think we'll ever find out who actually did it. And that is all about Elizabeth Short, aka the Black Dahlia. Thank you so much for watching this. Please feel free to comment, like the video, subscribe, whatever you want to do. Just let me know what it is that you like about these videos, what you don't like, what you want to know more of, what you want to know less of, and please, suggestions of different unsolved or solved murders and disappearances. I love doing the research, and I will totally take suggestions.